Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Tom Wilson never wanted a war. He moved to his secluded home for peace, far from the rules of suburban conformity. But when the HOA next door decided his land was theirs to control, they made a grave mistake. Lies, legal battles, and intimidation. Tom faced it all. But what they didn't know, he would never back down. Tom Wilson had always valued his independence. After years of working as an architect in the city, he finally found the perfect escape, a sprawling piece of land on the outskirts of a growing suburban development. The property came with a historic house, built decades before the surrounding neighborhoods even existed. It was secluded, peaceful, and most importantly, it belonged entirely to him. No homeowners association, no arbitrary rules, just pure freedom to live as he pleased. For the first few months, everything was quiet. He spent his days restoring the house, reinforcing the fences, and designing the perfect landscape. But then came the first letter. It arrived in an official-looking envelope, stamped with the insignia of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, HOA, a newly formed governing body for the upscale community that had sprung up adjacent to his land. The letter was curt and to the point. His property was in violation of HOA aesthetic guidelines, and he was required to submit renovation plans, pay outstanding fees, and adhere to their community standards. Tom was momentarily confused. He had never signed any agreement with the HOA. His land wasn't even part of their development. At first, he assumed it was a clerical mistake, a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved with a phone call. He dialed the number listed on the letter, only to be met with an exasperated sigh from Karen Miller, the HOA president. "Mr. Wilson, we don't make mistakes," she said in a clipped tone. "Your house is within our community's extended jurisdiction. The previous owners failed to comply, and we won't allow further negligence." Tom frowned, his patience thinning. "My property predates your HOA. I have no contractual obligation to follow your rules." Karen let out a short, humorless laugh. "Mr. Wilson, Maple Ridge is a premier residential area. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to escalate the matter. I suggest you rethink your position before penalties apply." Tom wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated. That night, he dug through his property deeds and land records, confirming what he already knew. His land was completely independent of the HOA. He wasn't bound by their rules, nor was he required to pay their fees. Confident in his legal standing, he drafted a formal response, rejecting their demands and warning them against further harassment. Days passed without further communication, and he assumed the issue had been settled. Then, the signs appeared. Literal ones. Overnight, HOA commission banners were placed along the perimeter of his property, stating, "This property does not meet Maple Ridge community standards. Expect renovations soon." Tom ripped them down immediately, but the message was clear. The HOA wasn't going to let this go. Then the complaints started. He'd see strangers loitering near his fence, whispering among themselves and shaking their heads disapprovingly. HOA representatives began conducting unsolicited inspections, walking up to his house and taking notes on their clipboards. The final straw came when he caught a group of men measuring his front lawn without permission. Storming outside, Tom demanded answers. One of the men, clad in an HOA-issued polo shirt, didn't even bother looking up from his notes. "Routine compliance assessment, sir," he said flatly. "We're evaluating necessary improvements." Tom had heard enough. "You step onto my property again, and I'll have you charged with trespassing," he snapped. The men exchanged glances before retreating, but not before one of them muttered, "We'll see about that." That evening, Tom watched as a black SUV slowly crawled past his house, its driver barely visible through the tinted windows. His gut told him this wasn't over. Over the next few weeks, the HOA's campaign against Tom escalated from passive-aggressive tactics to outright harassment. At first, it was small inconveniences, unsolicited notices left on his doorstep, warning of pending fines and unresolved compliance issues. His mailbox became stuffed with glossy HOA newsletters filled with not-so-subtle remarks about unkept properties lowering neighborhood values. At first, he ignored them, but then the real pressure began. One morning, he woke to the sound of construction equipment near his property line. Stepping outside, he found a work crew digging post holes along the edge of his land. At the center of it all stood Karen Miller, clipboard in hand, directing the workers. "What the hell is this?" Tom demanded, striding toward her. Karen barely glanced at him. "New perimeter fencing," she said, as if it were obvious. "We've decided to enclose all properties within Maple Ridge for aesthetic continuity." Tom clenched his fists. "You have no right to build anything on my land." Karen sighed, her exasperation as fake as the authority she was trying to project. "Mr. Wilson, your property is visibly neglected, and it's creating an eyesore. The HOA has taken the initiative to improve it at no cost to you." "No cost?" Tom scoffed. "You're trying to claim my land under your authority." Karen smiled tightly. "Once the fence is up, it will officially bring your property into the HOA's designated boundaries. You'll be a community member, whether you like it or not." Tom's blood boiled. "You set foot on my land again, and I'll call the police for trespassing." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Do that, Mr. Wilson, and you'll be the one facing charges. Our legal team has already begun filing a petition for eminent domain due to your property's impact on community aesthetics. If I were you, I'd start cooperating before this gets expensive." Tom stood his ground, refusing to move, as the workers hesitated, waiting for Karen's next command. After a long, tense pause, she finally relented. "Fine. We'll pause for now," she said, motioning for the crew to pack up. "But this isn't over." That night, Tom installed security cameras around his property. He wasn't paranoid, but he wasn't stupid either. Sure enough, within days, the footage captured HOA board members sneaking onto his land, taking photographs of his house and fences. When he confronted them, they muttered something about evidence collection and scurried off. Then came the real escalation. One afternoon, Tom returned home to find a bright orange notice pinned to his front door. It was from the county zoning office claiming that an anonymous complaint had been filed against his property. According to the report, his house had unpermitted structures and posed a potential safety hazard. If he didn't resolve the issue, he'd be facing heavy fines or even a forced demolition order. Furious, Tom called the zoning office, demanding to know who had filed the complaint. The answer didn't surprise him: the HOA. "They submitted over a dozen photos claiming you've been conducting unapproved renovations," the official explained. "They say your house doesn't meet community codes." Tom could hardly contain his rage. There were no community codes that applied to him. His land was completely separate from the HOA's jurisdiction, yet they were using every legal loophole they could find to squeeze him into compliance. The next morning, Tom filed his own formal cease and desist letter against the HOA for harassment. But before he could even celebrate taking the first step, the situation escalated once again. A neighbor, one of Karen's most loyal supporters, stood in his driveway, arms crossed. "Just take the deal, Wilson," the man muttered. "Join the HOA, pay your dues, and this all goes away." Tom stared him down. "I don't negotiate with bullies." The neighbor smirked. "Then you'll regret this." That night, someone slashed his tires. The next morning, Tom wasn't even surprised to find his tires slashed. He had seen this kind of intimidation before. Petty, underhanded, and just desperate enough to show that the HOA was running out of options. He checked his security cameras, hoping for a clear image of the culprit, but the person had kept their face hidden, working quickly under the cover of night. The footage, however, would be useful later, but Tom didn't have time to dwell on the damage. His real problem arrived later that afternoon. A loud knock at the door pulled him from his work. He opened it to find two uniformed police officers standing on his porch, hands resting near their belts. Behind them, standing with an air of self-importance, was Karen Miller, flanked by two HOA board members. "Mr. Wilson," one of the officers began, his tone firm, "we received a call about a trespassing complaint." Tom folded his arms, keeping his face neutral. "That's interesting," he said slowly, "because I own this land." Karen let out a dramatic sigh, stepping forward as if she were addressing a courtroom. "Officer, I am the president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, and I regret to inform you that this man is in violation of multiple HOA regulations. He has repeatedly ignored our notices, refused to comply with safety inspections, and has been illegally occupying property that falls under our jurisdiction." Tom's patience snapped. "That's a blatant lie," he said, turning to the officers. "I have my property deed inside. This land was never part of the HOA, and I have legal documents proving it." Karen scoffed. "With all due respect, officers, anyone can produce a piece of paper, but if you check the HOA's boundary map, you'll see that—" "We don't enforce HOA rules." The officer cut her off. His partner, a younger officer, looked between them uncertainly, sensing the tension. Unless this man is violating state or local law, this is a civil matter, not a police matter. Karen's face twisted in frustration. She had clearly expected the officers to march Tom off his own land, not question her authority. But he's trespassing, she insisted. This is HOA land. I have documentation. Tom turned and walked back into his house, returning moments later with his property deed and a folder of legal papers. Here, he said, holding them out to the officer. This is my land. I have never signed an agreement with the HOA, nor am I subject to their rules. I have footage of their members trespassing on my property at night. I have evidence of their harassment, and if they continue to push this, I will be filing my own police report. The older officer glanced over the paperwork, then handed it back. Everything here checks out, he said, looking at Karen. Ma'am, unless you have a legal claim to this land that can be upheld in court, you need to stop making false complaints. Karen's face flushed red. False complaints, she repeated, nearly sputtering. I have spent years keeping this community beautiful. I won't let some outsider ruin everything because he thinks the rules don't apply to him. The younger officer sighed, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Ma'am, this is his property. We're not getting involved. Karen's expression darkened. I'll take this to the county. I'll take this to the courts. You haven't heard the last of this. Tom smirked. Good. Maybe then a judge can explain property law to you. With that, the officers turned to leave, signaling the end of the dispute, for now. But Karen wasn't done. She shot Tom a look of pure venom before stomping off, barking orders at her board members as they retreated. Tom knew one thing for certain. She was far from finished. The police might have left, but Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, their failure to remove Tom from his own property only made her more determined to escalate the fight. Within 24 hours, she unleashed a new wave of attacks, this time pushing both legal and physical boundaries in ways Tom couldn't ignore. It started with the county inspector. A white government-issued vehicle rolled up Tom's driveway early in the morning. A man in a city uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. Mr. Wilson, he asked, adjusting his glasses. Tom, still half asleep with a cup of coffee in hand, nodded. What's this about? The inspector sighed, as if already tired of the situation. We received a complaint about your property violating local zoning codes, something about unpermitted structures and environmental hazards. Tom exhaled sharply. Karen. You're kidding me, he muttered. What exactly am I in violation of? The inspector checked his notes. The complaint alleges that your home does not meet fire safety standards, that you've made unauthorized modifications to the property, and that your septic system is outdated and needs inspection. Tom clenched his jaw. He hadn't modified anything. His property had passed all inspections when he purchased it, and there was no way his septic system had suddenly become an issue overnight. I'd like to conduct a brief inspection, the man continued, eyeing Tom's house. If violations exist, you'll have 30 days to fix them before fines are issued. Tom crossed his arms. Do you get a lot of anonymous complaints from HOA presidents trying to strong-arm independent homeowners? The inspector hesitated, then sighed. Let's just say, I've seen this before. Tom let him proceed. As expected, the inspector found nothing wrong. No violations, no safety hazards, just a waste of everyone's time. But before leaving, he gave Tom a warning. If they're pushing this hard, expect more. HOA boards like this don't stop until they get what they want. Tom was starting to realize that. That afternoon, Tom was in his backyard when he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery. He sprinted toward the front of his property, only to find a construction crew digging near his driveway. Workers in neon vests were hammering stakes into the ground while a bulldozer idled nearby. What the hell do you think you're doing? Tom barked. A foreman, wearing a hard hat and holding a clipboard, barely looked up. Installing a new HOA-mandated sidewalk, sir. Tom nearly laughed at the audacity. On my land. The man flipped a page on his clipboard. According to our work order, this section was approved by the HOA as part of a community beautification initiative. Rage surged through Tom's veins. My property is not part of the HOA. Before the foreman could respond, Karen arrived. She stepped out of her car with a smug grin, hands folded in satisfaction. Mr. Wilson, she said sweetly, I see you've met the crew. I told you we'd be moving forward with improvements and… Tom took a threatening step toward her. This is trespassing. Karen scoffed. It's not trespassing if it's a public pathway. We're simply integrating your property into the neighborhood. That's not how property law works, Tom growled. If your workers don't stop right now, I'll call the police and have every single one of them arrested. Karen's smile faltered just a little. Tom, let's be reasonable. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Get them off my land. Karen sighed dramatically and waved her hand. Pack it up, boys, for now. The crew backed off, loading their equipment into trucks. But as Karen left, she leaned in close to Tom. You're making a mistake, she whispered, and mistakes have consequences. Tom had never wanted to pursue legal action, but at this point, Karen wasn't leaving him much of a choice. Tom had reached his breaking point. The false complaints, the trespassing, the blatant attempts to steal his land, all of it had pushed him to a decision. If Karen and the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But this time, he was taking it to court. Within days, his attorney, Mark Delaney, a sharp real estate lawyer with a reputation for tearing HOAs apart in legal battles, filed a lawsuit against the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. The claims: harassment, trespassing, defamation, and attempted fraud. They had not only violated his property rights, but had actively tried to force him into compliance through intimidation and illegal means. Tom was done playing defense. The courtroom was packed on the first day of hearings. Several Maple Ridge residents showed up, some clearly siding with Karen, others just eager to see the drama unfold. Tom sat calmly with his attorney as Karen strutted in, flanked by her own legal team, expensive but outmatched. The HOA's defense was weak from the start. Their lawyer argued that Tom's property had always been intended to be part of Maple Ridge and that the HOA had every right to enforce their standards on what was essentially community land. Mark Delaney didn't even blink. He stood, walked to the judge, and slammed a stack of legal documents onto the desk. Your Honor, here is the original deed, survey, and land ownership records that prove, without question, that my client's land was never part of the Maple Ridge development. The HOA has no jurisdiction over him whatsoever. The judge flipped through the pages, nodding. Then, looking at the HOA's attorney, he asked, "Do you have any legal counterclaims to these documents?" There was a long, awkward silence. Karen, clearly panicking, whispered furiously to her lawyer, but there was nothing they could say. Then Delaney went for the kill. Your Honor, not only has the HOA knowingly and fraudulently attempted to claim my client's property, but we have evidence that they forged boundary documents to justify their harassment. At this, Tom's lawyer produced the falsified maps Karen had circulated, showing his land incorrectly marked as HOA property. The judge's eyes narrowed as he examined them. Ms. Miller, the judge said, turning to Karen, are you aware that submitting false property claims is considered real estate fraud? Karen, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid, but it got worse. Tom's security footage was played in court, showing HOA board members trespassing onto his land at night, measuring his fences, and even placing the fraudulent sidewalk markers. Then came the witnesses. Several Maple Ridge homeowners stood up against Karen. I moved here because I thought this HOA would be fair, one man admitted. But over time, I've seen how Karen uses her position to bully people. This lawsuit isn't just about Mr. Wilson. She's been doing this to all of us. Another woman added, she threatened to fine me $500 for planting the wrong type of roses in my yard. I wanted to speak up before, but I was afraid. Now, the entire court saw Karen for what she truly was, a tyrant. It didn't take long for the judge to make his ruling. The court finds that the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association knowingly engaged in harassment, trespassing, and fraudulent misrepresentation of property boundaries. The HOA will pay damages to Mr. Wilson for legal fees, emotional distress, and property damages. Then he turned to Karen directly. And as for you, Ms. Miller, this court is referring your actions for criminal investigation. If it is found that you knowingly falsified property claims, you may be facing felony charges. Karen went pale. Tom, however, simply leaned back in his chair. Justice had finally arrived. The courtroom ruling sent shockwaves through Maple Ridge. News of Karen's fraudulent activities spread quickly, and within a week, the once powerful HOA was in full-blown crisis mode. The first major consequence came swiftly. Karen was removed as president. The HOA board, desperate to save face, held an emergency meeting and voted her out unanimously. It was an act of self-preservation. The lawsuit had exposed not just Karen's fraud, but also how complicit the board had been in enabling her. But it was too late. The residents of Maple Ridge, many of whom had blindly followed Karen's rule, began turning against the HOA entirely. Tom's victory gave them the courage to speak out, and suddenly, homeowners who had been too afraid to push back before started questioning the HOA's entire existence. A petition circulated within days, demanding a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. What started as whispers became a movement. Meanwhile, Karen's personal downfall was even more spectacular. After the judge's ruling, the county launched a criminal investigation into her fraudulent boundary claims. It turned out that Tom wasn't her first victim. She had been trying to redraw property lines for years, subtly expanding the HOA's jurisdiction over lots that never legally belonged to them. It was real estate fraud, a felony. Facing possible jail time, Karen's lawyer cut a deal. She agreed to resign from all HOA activities permanently and pay additional damages to homeowners she had wrongfully fined over the years. But the legal fees alone ruined her financially. Karen was forced to sell her house and leave the neighborhood in disgrace. With Karen gone, the HOA board collapsed under pressure. The financial damage from the lawsuit, combined with a flood of new complaints against their practices, left the HOA bankrupt. The final blow came when the petition to dissolve the HOA passed by an overwhelming majority. Residents no longer wanted to be governed by an organization that had allowed a dictator like Karen to run unchecked. And just like that, Maple Ridge HOA ceased to exist. Tom watched it all unfold from the sidelines, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. He had never wanted this fight, but he had refused to back down when his rights were threatened. Now, standing on his porch, looking out over his land that no one could ever again try to claim from him, he felt true victory. His property was his, forever.